The preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Judy Rubin, and I'm president of the board of the 92nd Street Y. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the newly renovated Button-Weiser Hall for the opening night of our series, Critics on Criticism, which this year focuses on the theater. Before I introduce our speakers, just a few details about this evening. Following the moderated conversation on stage, you will have an opportunity to ask questions of our guests. As you entered the hall, you were given index cards on which to write the questions, and about 45 minutes into tonight's discussion on stage, the ushers will collect the cards and bring them backstage where they will be sorted prior to presentation. Most of you already know the order of the series, but for those of you who do not, tonight's guest speaker will be Robert Brustein, who has graciously agreed to switch dates with Walter Kerr, who was unable to appear here tonight as planned. Mr. Kerr will participate in the series, however, on Tuesday, November 5th. The other two evenings, October 29th with Bonnie Maranka and January 6th with Frank Rich, remain as scheduled. This series developed out of a desire to examine the role and the world of the drama critic, to give us a better understanding of the values the critic brings to his work, and to learn how four leading critics view the state of the theater today. It is our pleasure to have as series moderator Jane Moss, currently the executive director of the Alliance of Resident Theaters New York and co-director of the FEDAPT Development Theater Workshop. Ms. Moss served as the managing director of Playwrights Horizons for 3 seasons. At the end of this year, Ms. Moss will be leaving Art New York in order to devote her time and energies to co-producing an international theater festival to be held in this city in 1987-1988. Our guest tonight is Robert Brustein, a major force in the contemporary theater. As actor, director, educator, critic, and panel member to both the NEH and the NEA, he is currently the artistic director of the American Repertory Theater Company in Cambridge, Massachusetts, the director of the Loeb Drama Center, and a professor of English at Harvard. Prior to this, Robert Brustein served as the dean of the Yale School of Drama and was the founder and artistic director of the Yale Repertory Theater from 1966 to 1979. He is the author of several books, as well as articles and reviews for the New Republic, the New York Times, the New York Review of Books, the Atlantic Monthly, and many others. His awards include a Ford, a Guggenheim, and a Fulbright Fellowship. And as an actor, he has played over 70 roles in theater and on television, and we are proud to say he has appeared on the stage here at the 92nd Street Y. He doesn't remember quite when, he thinks it was in the early 50s somewhere. In any case, it is indeed an honor to have him back to the Y this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Jane Moss, our moderator, and Robert Brustein, our special guest. Thank you.
Good evening, all of you. I think actually I find it to be an incredibly exciting situation that the 92nd Street Y is actually doing a series on theater criticism. I think it's an incredibly important and often overlooked area of the theater activity and the theater scene, both in New York and across the country, and I think in many instances is all too often neglected. And I'm, of course, very pleased to be starting off with Mr. Brustein. My first question for you, Bob, is that you were the only critic in this series who was also an actor. Okay, sorry. Okay, I'll try again. Is that better? Okay. You were the only critic in this series who is also an active theater practitioner who works in the theater as a director, an actor, an artistic director, and producer. And I'm very interested to know how your creative work affects your criticism and vice versa. And do you feel being both a practitioner and a critic is sort of the ideal state of affairs for being a critic?
It's a very complicated and scratchy state of affairs to be both a practitioner and a critic. It has radically transformed my approach to criticism. I began as a practitioner, but after giving that up, I turned to criticism and was noted for my highly opinionated, incredibly aggressive, angry, and outrageous opinions about the theater, and which I managed to juggle for about 13 or 14 years until I went to Yale and started practicing, both as an educator, a trainer of theater people, and a director of a newly founded theater called the Yale Repertory Theater. And I stopped writing criticism during that period, quite properly and appropriately, since I was practicing. And it wasn't until I left Yale in 1979 and went to Cambridge that I went back to the New Republic, where I've been, again, for the last 7 years. I've been there since 1959, so I've been practicing criticism for quite a long time. And I did find that my approach to criticism had undergone a fundamental change at that point. And how can I describe that change? It was a growing suspicion about my own opinions. Not that I doubted my opinions in the past. In fact, I was ferociously ready to defend them and support them and reiterate them if necessary. But the more I worked in the theater, the more I recognized that opinion making was not really the crucial and most important aspect of criticism, at least for me. T.S. Eliot speaks of two cardinal aspects of criticism. He speaks of the elucidation of the texts and the correction of taste. Now, that juicy correction of taste, of course, is what attracts most critics to the practice of criticism. To be able to tell all of you, where you've gone wrong and where I've gone right. The elucidation of the text, of course, is something you do as a result of studying the field, understanding the tradition and the history of dramatic literature, knowing a lot about every aspect of the theater, and theoretically and ideally being very, very intelligent. But the second is what draws most people to the theater and to theater criticism, that is correction of taste. And it began to dawn on me that if I had to measure my own worth in posterity by how many times I've been right or wrong about a play or an actor that had come before me, that I just as well give up. Because looking back at criticism in the past, looking back at the very best critics, like Bernard Shaw, for example, it's remarkable how often he was wrong. He was most famously wrong about Oscar Wilde's Importance of Being Earnest, which he thought was a trivial, unnecessary play that would not last out the season, much less as it has happened to last out the last 70 or 80 years. So it was a worrisome thing to feel that you were going to have to sit there passing judgment on actors, directors, and playwrights, and that was going to be the way you validated your life. I drew back from this for another reason, not simply the fact that I might be wrong. Obviously, I'm very opinionated, so I still have my opinions. But the opinion no longer forms the basis of the review, the basis of the criticism. Something else has to happen. There has to be a context. There has to be a sense in which that opinion takes place. Because saying for the 50,000th time that this particular commercial piece of trivia is no good, and finding different ways to say that is really a vapid and, I think, totally useless form of activity. So unless one finds a way to put it into a context, a positive context, as it were, and to understand why, for what social or political or even religious, metaphysical reasons or philosophical reasons this work is no good, then we are just involved in an empty exercise. And that is what I tried to do from the beginning of my criticism. And as time went on, and I started writing criticism as a theater director, and therefore a very compromised critic, because I shouldn't be writing criticism at all. I had to find ways, not simply to say the play was bad or the director was bad or the actor was bad, to try and find a way to present to the public, to my readers, small as that readership might be, the reasons in context why our theater was not functioning or why our theater was functioning. And that's what I came to take as my function.
My second question, which is somewhat related to what you're alluding to, which is sort of a more general philosophical question, which is what is the role of criticism in relationship to the actual art form? I think living in New York, as we all do, and where there is such an amazing amount of activity, we tend to view criticism as a consumer report. I mean, it tells you what you should see and what you shouldn't see. And I like to think that criticism can do much more than that, and in the best of all possible worlds, can create a very healthy climate for discourse about the form. Unfortunately, I think criticism more and more is going in the direction of consumer reports because more and more dollars are being invested in a particular production and so on and so forth. But I would really like to hear your response as to what you think criticism should be versus what it is.
Well, I think you put it very well, Jane. It has become an exercise in commodity transactions. Willy-nilly. I don't think critics want to do this, but willy-nilly, particularly in the newspapers, they're forced to do this because they are talking to a public that wants to know not a lot of information about the theater, but whether it's worthwhile spending their $45 or $50 on this particular play. And when you think how much you all have to spend to go to a Broadway play now, I mean, not simply the $50 each for the ticket, that's $100, but the parking of your car, which might be as much as another $12 or $15, your dinner out, which is a good $60 or $70, your babysitter if you have small children. We're talking about, you know, considerable numbers of shares in IBM, which were, one would think, much better invested than in the kinds of plays you might be going to on Broadway. So it becomes a very important responsibility for the newspaper critic to tell you it's not worth spending your money on X, it's worth spending your money on Y. But he then finds himself cast in the role not of a genuine critic, but of a consumer guide. And I think that's very painful for the people who have to practice in that way, but it's a job, a function that's forced on them.
Well, and I mean, I think the other thing that has gone, unfortunately, hand in hand with that is, which I guess is something we'll probably get into later, which is the whole power of the media in general and how that has impacted on the theater, which is the critic now also has this mysterious thing that we keep referring to as power. I mean, whenever people talk about the critics, they talk about the power of the critics. Again, I think this is particularly true in New York. And the power of the critics to make or break a career, the power of a critic to make a struggling off-Broadway actor a movie star, or a struggling off-Broadway playwright, you know, a screenwriter, which I think is only compounding the problem. And I also think this is further compounded by the fact that as a theater person, I, for one, really regret the fact that the leading, it used to be that sort of the elite, leading American intellectual lights no longer write about the theater anymore. So, I mean, the Susan Sontags, the Elizabeth Hardwicks, the Eric Bentleys, these people by and large do not write about the theater anymore, and I would like to hear your response as to why they don't write about it. But I think one of the major problems with their absence is that all we have left are the daily critics and the TV reviewers and sort of the media makers.
There are still magazine critics, and the magazine critics are of some consequence and some intelligence, but you're quite right that no one of the intellectual stature of Wilfred Sheed, for example, and Elizabeth Hardwick and Susan Sontag and Bentley and Gilman and Kaufman, and, you know, people who really committed themselves to theater criticism are really that engaged with it. And I think the problem is New York. They live in New York. If they're going to examine any kind of theater, it has to be New York theater. And frankly, New York theater isn't all that interesting anymore. It's also not all that glamorous anymore, and I think all of us, and I include myself, as critics, were initially attracted as negative critics, as adversary critics to the Broadway theater because it was an important giant. It was there to be, you know, we were going to be Goliath, and we were going to knock down that theater. Much to our surprise, we did knock down that theater, or at least the theater fell down. And we figured we must have had something to do with it, and not only to our surprise, but to our chagrin, because we needed that adversary. Without that adversary, we had nothing to write about as New York critics. And so a number of us just disappeared from the scene. I think that's what happened. Others of us, and I'm using this generic us, we, me, for example, we went off and tried to do something about it. And what we did was join a movement and try and reinforce a movement that was going to be an alternative to the commercial theater, not to obliterate it, not to destroy it, but to provide audiences with another possibility that was not a commodity theater, that was an art theater, and that was institutionalized in the sense that it would live in spite of what the critics said about it, that it would stand in spite of the fact that the critics said this actor is terrible or that play is awful, that the life would continue, and it would continue to grow. And that's what we felt, I particularly felt, to be the most important aspect, the most important ambition and reason for being in the theater in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, was to create that theater, which the Europeans had known, and we had not known since the days of the group theater. To get that permanent ensemble of people who know how to work together the way a football team works together, the way a baseball team works together, and through this continual evolvement and organic relationship to each other, create the best works of art. It is not the all-stars that win the baseball games, it's the team that's been playing together. It's not stars. And over again, we've seen that when you collect stars together, no matter how good they are as actors, and they are very good, if you collect them together for a single enterprise, they're not going to be as interesting as a group that's been working together over 2 or 3 years, who are not stars, but know the kind of plays that the others are involved in, know the vocabulary, know the shorthand, know how to deal into the other's strengths and to support the person's strengths and to cover his weaknesses or her weaknesses. That's a very important and different approach to theater than we had experienced on Broadway as critics in the past and as audiences in the past. So that's what we tried to create. And I think there's been some success in creating that. There have been some failures. It has not been a completely successful movement, the resident theater movement, because the Broadway system, the commodity system, was a very powerful system. It continues to be so, even as it's in a period of considerable deterioration. And as a result began kind of collecting some of the resident theaters into its own perimeters there and changing their nature and making them into tryout houses for Broadway. And that's the big problem with New York. As New Yorkers, and I'm a New Yorker myself, I was born in this city and I lived just 8 blocks away for many years with my wife before we moved to New Haven. But I must say that New York, as Walt Whitman once said, is not the place to grow fruit, it's the place where you sell it. And if you can't grow fruit here, you're really laboring under a very serious handicap in regard to the arts. Let me say one other thing about the theater. It's one of the few arts in which both the popular form of it and the art form of it somehow are subsumed under the same rubric. You wouldn't expect Jackson Pollock, once he's, there's a rave review about Jackson Pollock, let's say by Hilton Kramer in the New York Times. Jackson Pollock is not then picked up to do in the cartoon section and to become a cartoonist. Whereas if there's a rave review for Actor X by Frank Rich in the New York Times, that actor is invariably picked up to go into some series on television. And the fact that the same very good actor can function as in a television series, can function in the movies, and can function on Broadway theater and in resident theaters. I mean, those are 4 completely different functions. It confuses the issue. And it confuses the actor, especially when all of his peers and his family and his grandmother are all saying, what are you working for $350 a week? You could make thousands in television. And his agent is telling him or her, you're nuts to be in that resident theater. You should be in television or be a movie star. And the actor, no matter how much integrity he or she has, ultimately begins to yield to the pressures of that system, where his peer group, his parents, his agents, and everyone else is telling him, you're nuts, get out there and make some dough. But that's what they measure success by in our country.
My question to you is whether you feel, because it is something that I feel, which is that in the absence of, just to stick with the criticism issue just for a moment, which is that I do think that the absence of, for lack of a better word, sort of serious writers writing about the theater in an essay form, not even as criticism, that it does undermine the theater's attempt to be taken seriously as an art form. I mean, I do think that when the bulk of the power is being shifted to TV reviewers, that you are then in a situation where indeed the theater becomes the most prestigious branch of the entertainment industry.
Exactly.
I mean, as opposed to a serious art form.
Well, the fact the theater critic is not really a primary critic anymore. I can talk to you about it out of my own experience. I mean, the theater critic was once the most significant critic on a newspaper or a magazine. And the fact is, many magazines have now dispensed with theater criticism. And if they have dispensed with it, they've cut it back. I used to write either once a week or once every 2 weeks, mostly once a week. Now I write once every 3 weeks. And if something important has happened in the culture, I get bumped for the next issue. I'm waiting 2 weeks for the review to come out already, you know, so to get bumped another week, people have forgotten the play ever existed. I know Jack Kroll of Newsweek has the same problem. He's one of the very few critics who really goes out there to follow works that he thinks are going to be interesting. He'll go anywhere to see them. He has trouble getting them into Newsweek. Newsweek, first of all, says, well, it's, you know, who's interested? It's taking place in Philadelphia. And secondly, they'll say, look, you had a couple of columns this week, but there's been a crisis in Israel. That's the end of your column. So I don't want to make it sound as though it's sour grapes, or, you know, but we are fighting for space in a way that I would say 15, 20 years ago we didn't have to fight for space, and that's because people are just not interested. In spite of the fact there are so many people here in a theater criticism symposium, but they're really not all that interested in theater criticism.
But I also would say that we're fighting battles that other art forms are not fighting. I mean, I find it extraordinary that in the Sunday section of the Arts and Leisure section, the column that was Walter Kerr's column and then Benedict Nightingale's column has not been able to find a permanent replacement in like 18 months now, or a year. Mm-hmm. And there would not be a similar situation in either their book review section or their music section. I mean, I think that and moreover, even the New York Times, not currently, but in the past, has certainly hired theater critics that have no background in theater. I mean, there is this feeling that anybody can write about it.
Yes, it's true. There is a feeling that anybody can write about it, and they're right. Anybody can write about the theater that you're seeing here in New York at this particular time. And, you know, everybody's opinion is as good as anybody else's. I don't think it needs any background or learning or scholarship to review Cats or Cage aux Folles or any of the other, or Dreamgirls or any of the other major, you know, successes of our time. What does it need in the way of background for that?
That's a very sorry state of affairs. Where do you think the new critics will be coming from? And where do you think, what will their outlets be?
Well, let me say something that might sound very odd to your ears. I think we are presently going through one of the most exciting periods for the theater, and American theater, that in my lifetime, I've never known anything like it. I've never known so many artists of genuine consequence to be attracted to the stage. I'm not saying that they're popular or everybody knows about them, but it's a very unusual thing happening in this country, which is bound, it seems to me, to start attracting critics to it who are there in order to analyze it, to parse it, to investigate it, to cope with it, to attack it, I mean, to deal with it, as they would with that old Goliath Broadway. So I think we're heading, if I can predict, I think we're heading for a very happy, forceful, and energetic time. I don't know what the context is going to be for these critics. I don't know whether they're going to be writing. Don't know what newspapers or magazines they're writing for. The artists are itinerant. They're all over the place. They're not situated in one location. But following them around as they go from here to Germany, to Venice, to France, to Los Angeles, to Cambridge, to the Guthrie and what have you, I think following them around is a real function for a committed and exciting critic.
Bob, this sort of takes me into a whole other area, which is sort of what's going on in the theater today. And I agree with you that I think most people in this room would probably be agreed that it is not happening on Broadway by and large. Do you really see it happening in the regional theater? Do you really see the nonprofit network picking up on the energy that was Broadway's?
I think something interesting has happened to certain resident theaters, and something very uninteresting has happened to other resident theaters. But I don't want to talk about those if I can help it. I want to talk about the interesting things. And that is
I'll let you talk about the interesting things first.
That is this interesting meeting of the Avant God Artist, who 20 years ago was doing Dionysus in '69 and McBird and the Living Theater and what have you. The meeting of that anarchic wild man or woman with the classics, with tradition. There's a marriage going on here that I have not known about until very recently. That is a marriage between the really imaginative, auteur, individualistic, avant-garde experimental artist and a text. And that meeting is sending up terrific sparks. It's getting a lot of people unhappy, but it's also getting a lot of people excited. And it's creating an entirely new and very refreshing and invigorating approach to very familiar classical plays. And it's bringing them into our lives again in a way that makes them absolutely immediate and very exciting. And that, I think, is going to prove to be one of the most important things that's happened in the 80s.
I think that ties into sort of another sort of series of thoughts that I've been having, which is that I do think in almost all quarters, certainly again in New York, in almost all quarters of the theater industry, there is this concern that the theater is, quote unquote, either losing its audience or the audience that it has is in no way connected with what's going on stage. Particularly, there's a concern about young people and getting young people into the theater. And I think that for some people, they do, yet at the same time, events like the Next Wave Festival are pulling in young people in droves.
You betcha.
And I think that there is an interesting issue as to whether the way the American theater has been encased in the naturalistic, realistic aesthetic, whether that is indeed beginning to drive audiences away simply because TV and movies can do it better. Because there is a way in which the American theater artist is now being forced to re-examine what is indeed theatrical versus what is television, what is movies.
I think it's a very well taken point, Jane. The fact is the theater has to be the theater. Let Reagan be Reagan and let the theater be the theater. And
so
let television be television
same.
and movies be movies. And you're quite right. The theater can no longer simulate authenticity, reality, in anywhere near as perfect a manner as taking your camera right onto the actual, the house. We always have to simulate a house up here, and you always know it's a fake house. And when you open the door, the flat moves and shakes, and you know it's holding up that flat. And you may ooh and ah when the water goes on in a faucet on the stage, but you're oohing and ahhing because you're not suspending your disbelief. You're just saying, isn't it good that they can simulate that sort of thing on the stage? Whereas when you go to the movies and you go into some tenement and you see rats running around the floor, this is reality. That's not reality on the stage. This movie is reality, and a television documentary is reality, and frankly, who needs it? What you need on the stage is imagination, it's magic, it's what the stage can do better than anything else, and that is give you the liveness of contact between one group of human beings and the other. Right? That's almost a cliche when people talk about the theater, but it remains a very important one. The fact that in talking to you now, I can look you in the eye, and I'm not an image looking you in the eye or pretending to see you. I'm actually someone who's seeing you. It's very important. I mean, think about a record, for example. I was just thinking about that today. A record of a jazz quintet, which was recorded in 1945, is not the jazz quintet. It's a simulation. It's a collection of vinyl and electronics, but it is simulating something that actually happened. It's not what actually happened, no matter how real it may sound. And it's the same thing with that flat movie screen. Even if they make it three-dimensional, it is a simulation. And it took place in the past. It's boxed. There's no surprise in it. Nothing's going to happen like that, where suddenly I'm going to lose control of my legs, or I'm going to get a cramp or something, and you'll see my cramp. That can't happen in the movies. It's all edited out. Whereas what's happening here now, between us, is a transaction. And that is something that you can't substitute for in any other art
No,
form.
but I think it used to be that you could do a naturalistic play and it would work, quote unquote, work better with an audience than it does now. I mean, I recently went to see The Iceman Cometh, which I enjoyed a great deal, and the woman who was sitting next to me was talking about how, first of all, she was not enjoying the experience, but she really, really loved going to the movies. I mean, there was something about the theater experience that was either foreign to her or what she was seeing on stage was sort of like the movies, but not really. I mean, you know, and as a result, I think what is happening is the kind of theater that is working most powerfully with audiences, and again, I think it's particularly young audiences, are theater events that use a rich visual vocabulary. I mean, they use different kinds of
Or
things.
no vocabulary.
Yes, exactly.
Or no vocabulary.
Yeah, I
that
mean,
also works.
Yeah, I mean, it's totally. I mean, it's a whole shift as to what the vocabulary that theater artists can use that will indeed reach an audience. Now, I don't know if that is also furthered by the fact that, you know, people are being bombarded by MTV, and I mean, they're being bombarded with images all the time now.
Well, two things. First of all, The Iceman Cometh, which remains a great play, regardless of the woman who prefers the movies. I mean, this is a great, great play. And we're lucky to have had this writer go through all the pain he went to and write all those lousy plays in order to write this great play, along with Long Day's Journey. It remains a great play. This particular production, which is very similar to the production done in 1956, which was wonderful then, and it still is wonderful in its way, has forgotten that there have been movies and have been television. It should have done something else. I mean, O'Neill gives you all the clues. He says this is a play that's taking place underwater. This production should have taken place underwater. There should have been some imaginative scenic construction and acting approach that paralleled the various changes that have been going on in the theater in our time. I think the Quintero production did not. Good as it was, it's very good, it's very well acted, but it still left us with a feeling of déjà vu, you know, of kind of a reconstruction of something that worked very well, without recognizing that time passes and we change, and we've been absorbing a lot of different images, and maybe it would have been nice to bring some of those onto the stage.
This woman's comment, though, made me think of the David Denby article, which I know you responded to, I believe you responded to in the New Republic, which was, this was an article in the Atlantic Monthly, which I think came out in January or last winter at some point. And it was entitled Theater Phobia, which was a charming name for it. And it was about how there are so many people, again, he was addressing the New York marketplace, where there are so many people who are intelligent, who go to many cultural events, such as the ballet, such as the New Gallery in Soho, such as the newest foreign film by Bergman, but they will not go to the theater. And I don't know if you want to in any way recapitulate your response to that.
I'd rather make another point,
Okay.
Which is that, I agree with a lot of what Denby says. We all recognize that the theater has become a very uncomfortable, a very unpleasant, and often a very boring place to be. And there's nothing more boring than sitting with a lot of people and not enjoying yourself.
After they've paid a lot of money.
But also, if it works, it's the most exciting place to be. It wipes any film out. I saw a film the other day which I loved because it was like a play. It was Weatherby. I thought, this movie, Weatherby, it's not really a film, you know. It uses film, but it's written by a playwright, David Hare. It's an English film. And I thought, this has the texture and depth of a wonderful play. And I love film. I go all the time, but I go to escape. I don't go for, deep experiences. I had a real experience at this movie because it was like a play. I thought to myself, that's why I like the theater. The theater gives you this. The movies don't give you this, except very exceptional moments. The theater gives you this. And so I think that's what Denby hasn't had that experience. And we all suffer for it. I'm willing to go 100, 1,000 times for that one experience because it'll haunt me for the rest of my life. I'll never forget it. It'll change me. It'll change my sensibility. It'll change the way I think about myself, about the way I think about life. It's not going to change my politics or anything. I don't believe in that. But it's going to change my world in some way. And movies won't do that for me. The other thing about the theater is this community of the audience. People always leave the audience out when they talk about the theater, but I found it's a more and more important aspect. It's the other actor in the theater. The theater can't exist without the audience. When you go to the movies, you don't want any audience. You want to sit alone. If someone gets in front of you, you move, right? You stay there. I want my popcorn and I want an unobstructed view of the stage. But if you've got 4 or 5 seats next to you in the theater, you feel alone. Because you are sitting there as a society, as a community. You may not know anyone else in the theater, but they become your community when you watch a play. And if that community works, and it forms a harmony in relationship to an object on the stage, then in some secret way you think maybe society can work. Because it's a society in miniature. And it becomes a hope for a social, uniform grace. I think that's one of the reasons we also hope for the theater, in spite of all the disappointment.
Now, do you find that when you are writing a review or writing criticism in general, that you are writing for the audience? I mean, is there an audience you have in mind, or are you writing more for the artist, or are you, I mean, who are you writing for?
That's another interesting question, because I must say it's changed a lot over the years. I thought I knew exactly who my readers were in 1959, 60, 61. They were a well-educated, college-educated, kind of occasional theater-going, intellectual readership. I don't know who they are now. I don't know who reads me in the New Republic. Don't know if anybody reads me. So, given
we're going to take a poll at the end of
this. Given that luxury of being an unread critic, you then begin to write more for. Well, who do you write for? You write for some posterity, I guess. You write for someone, if this thing ever gets published or someone ever goes back into the back pages of the Republic to say, this guy is not a total schmuck. This guy really seemed intelligent to me.
The experiences, some of the most joyful experiences I have had, and particularly the critic that leaps to mind is Kenneth Tynan reviews, some of which I think are very, very special. And I think that the way in which they are special is that they really recreate the event that he saw. I mean, it is amazing the way you can read him and you know exactly what it felt like to be there.
That was a real art.
Yeah, which I think is like an extraordinary capacity that criticism has, and I think it's ultimately the strongest capacity it has in terms of reaching readers.
That's an appreciative art of criticism. It's not as easy,
Well, no, I would assume.
You have to work very hard at that. And it seemed to come with ease to him. He did it beautifully. He could call up what something looked like through a phrase or an analogy, and you know exactly what it looked like. And the rest of us labor, and sweat for hours in order to get just the nearest approximation of trying to call up a visual look. But when I say that's appreciative, it's a response to what happened on the stage, an attempt to give that back to the audience. You didn't see it, here's what it looked like. And when you go to see it, you get that extra enjoyment of the description of it by a major critical artist like
Well, and
Tynan.
it also allows the reader of that review to have a sense of, again, even if they don't see that production, it gives them a sense of what theater can be. I mean, I think part of the problem I feel at the moment, this is a very personal feeling on my part, is that at times, again, particularly in beleaguered New York, you start being concerned about what theater can be, because so often you are beaten down by a lot of work that does not inspire you, and you begin to lose sight of what it can be. And this is where I think criticism at its very best can sort of create that excitement, assuming that they are watching something that is inducing that excitement, and significantly add to the art form.
Don't have much of it anymore. What you have now is opinion making, which continues to be important, and I think the major newspapers, particularly the Times, has to do that, and I think Frank Rich does that as well as anyone I know. Just, giving you his opinion and giving it to you in a lively and sprightly prose, and do you waste money on this or don't you waste money on it? Or you get the kind of performance that John Simon does, and the fact is he is doing a performance.
Now talk about that, because that's interesting, because Critic is celebrity, and I find that...
As performer, really.
And also, if you could tie that into talking about the rage that these critics start feeling after a while, because you have mentioned that in some of your books, and I think it's very interesting, because it seems to be an ongoing problem that there is this rage level that builds up.
I think that may have been true at one time when you could really work up indignation over bad art. But when if you've chosen to watch it for 35 to 40 years, it must give you some pleasure. It stimulates certain, aggressive fountains in your being. And I think with Simon, I wrote a review that hurt him deeply, I think, because I was once an old friend of his, and I think I got him his first criticism job. Don't go after me. But I think I was taking him too seriously. I wasn't recognizing that he probably is as much of a performer as the people he watches. And if you can just, which is virtually impossible, stop thinking of him as a brutal, murderous vampire figure who's going for the throats of, particularly of any woman who does not suit his particular aesthetic sensibilities at any given time, with her wattles and her uberous breasts and all this grandiose vocabulary of abuse that he's developed. If you look at him as someone who's an entertainer, and unfortunately, in order to entertain, he has to use these victims as his material. The kind of magician that saws through the body, but is actually sawed through the body. You might find him, you might be able to accept him more than I've been able to accept him over the last 20 years.
This leads into another question, though, and it is a question as someone who represents 86 nonprofit theaters in New York City, that, of course, comes up all the time, particularly in the face of a kind of, at times, gratuitous negative criticism, which is, to what extent is the critic responsible for supporting not a particular production, but supporting the art form in some way? I think that for many of the theater practitioners, they do feel that the critics are like going after them with no respect at all for what the endeavor is about. And I'm sure you've been the recipient of that, so you should be able to appreciate.
I've been on both ends.
Yeah, you've been on both ends.
I've been on both ends, so I look at it from both ends. And from the critic's end, the argument against destructive criticism, which I think was probably enjoined by Shaw better than anyone. Shaw said he couldn't care whether the theater was destroyed. Every playwright went up in smoke. There never was another actor, as far as he's concerned, as long as the truth prevailed. I mean, that is the argument for destructive criticism. And there is a certain argument to be made there. If you feel you have to suppress the truth in order to let the form survive, then you're doing something that ultimately is soiling you, and it's soiling what you're doing, and it's soiling your readers ultimately. You have to tell the truth as best you can. At least you have to think you're telling the truth. On the other hand, you're quite right. I mean, there is an obligation for the critic he's involved in this art form, he has to somehow reinforce it. And this continual slashing back and forth, which I spoke about when I first started, not very coherently, but what I was trying to say is the judgment, the yes or no judgment, what Danny Kaye called the Himalaya judgment. Because when someone asked him how he liked the Himalayas, he said, loved him, hated her. And that is most criticism. Loved this play, hated this play, loved the actor, hated the actress. That is not criticism. That is simply opinionating, really. And it's not valuable in any way whatsoever, except, of course, in this commodity way of selling tickets or not selling tickets. And that is not criticism. So I do believe that it is important for critics to reinforce the form. And I once wrote an article called Where Are the Repertory Critics? And by that I meant we have developed repertory theaters, we've developed repertory actors, we've developed repertory designers and know how to design for 2 plays at one time. No repertory critics. They don't understand how a permanent theater is different from, say, the Schuberts or the Nederlanders. They don't understand how a non-profit institution which does, say, 8, 9 different plays with the same company over the course of a year is different from a commercial producing unit that is doing plays primarily for the purpose of profit with a different group each time. And if you don't understand that, you're not a critic, because you cannot simply say that the actor was rotten playing Solness in The Master Builder when just a few weeks ago you said that actor was wonderful playing Iago in Othello. I mean, that's the same actor. Aren't you going to recognize it's the same actor? Or you're just dealing with that moment? You've got to deal with the progress of the actor as well. You've got to deal with the fact that this play is in that schedule and this play is in the schedule, and there must be some relationship between those plays. They're all in the schedule for a reason. You have to deal with the fact that this audience that's coming is not a fly-by-night audience. It's an audience that has decided to go along with this theater and watch it from play to play. And they recognize each other, just as they recognize the actors, just as they begin to recognize the aesthetic of the theater. So the theater becomes a work of art as well as the works of art on the stage. That's something we're not getting critics to acknowledge. There are 3 or 4 critics in this country I know that recognize that it's different and treat it differently. They're still looking for stars. They're looking for the star show that can come out of that season and move to New York. Or the star actor that they can pull out of the company and send to Hollywood to play opposite Meryl Streep. It's really what it's all about. Who's the star of the week? What's the food of the week? What's the restaurant of the week? How many stars for this? How many stars for that? That's what it's all about. It's commodity making.
I'm sort of shifting topics completely, and I'm shifting topics because it's something that you return to, a theme you return to over and over again in your writings, which is this whole, I guess, relationship, for lack of a better word, between the Broadway theater and the nonprofit theater. And in your mind, from the very beginning, and in my estimation, quite appropriately, you were cautioning against such a relationship. And in your most recent review in the New Republic, you did refer to, I can't remember what it was a review of actually, but you were talking about how you have referred to the fact that Broadway, which I loved, that Broadway was in a coma, which I thought was such an accurate way of describing it. But at the same time, you also made note of the fact of various changes in artistic directors in various regional theaters, and that the nonprofit theater and the institutional theater, that there were major problems lurking there as well, as various people continue to be seduced by New York, where there continues to be, in my estimation, a non-commitment from the acting community to the nonprofit institutional theater world. I mean, I am just wondering, Broadway is clearly in a crisis. It has empty theaters, it has skyrocketing costs. I mean, all their problems are very evident to the world. I think with the nonprofit institutional theater, it's more of sort of an underground kind of artistic mediocrity that's hard to get at as being, which in my estimation is a comparable problem given the ideals of the movement. And it's a problem that's harder to get at because they have big subscription bases and they have better fundraising techniques. And I mean, I sense that there is a potential artistic crisis going on in the nonprofit theater as well as the Broadway theater. And I'm wondering, first of all, your response to that assessment, and also whether you think in some way they're related.
That's a wonderful question. You've answered it. Yes, they are related. And mediocrity anywhere is mediocrity. And I think I'd rather look at Broadway mediocrity than nonprofit theater mediocrity. It's much less depressing. And indeed, the movement, and we speak of the movement, there are some 250 nonprofit theaters in this country, and they're bound to be different. You can't expect a uniform, unilateral kind of theater to emerge out of this movement. And in many cases, these theaters in, let's say, Cleveland or Cincinnati have to replace the commercial theater, and they have to give the audience what they're not getting because they don't get commercial theater in that town. There's very little touring going on anymore, so this X theater in X city is going to have to act like a Broadway theater and give that audience what it's missing. Entertainment, in short. It is not deserving of the phrase nonprofit, and certainly not deserving the phrase art theater, but nevertheless, you can recognize the need. There is also, and I guess I've been most vehement about these theaters because I think they're failing their birthright the most severely. Those very good theaters that began with high ideals and produced their first success that went to Broadway and somehow ended up, whether consciously or unconsciously, trying to find that other success that's going to go to Broadway, get together those same people for that same organization, that same composite that's going to go on to Broadway. And I don't think that is a function of the nonprofit theater. I think if the nonprofit theater does a show and it's very successful and It deserves to be seen by more people, there's no question about that. But that's a post factum thing. It happens after the fact, not before the fact. More and more we find producers going to nonprofit theaters and saying, do this show for us, we want to try it out with you, we'll give you participation in the profits, and then we're bringing it to Broadway. And that, of course, is the corruption of the nonprofit movement. Just as it's the corruption of Broadway, it's not working. It worked for a little while, but it's really not working. Because, here's the thing, Broadway's lost its audience. There is no more New York theater-going audience that I know of. When I go to the theater, I don't recognize the audience anymore. I used to recognize the audience even if I didn't know them personally. I knew where they came from. I felt, I could identify them. They were middle-class Jews, largely, a lot of homosexuals, a few blacks. You knew who the audience was. Now I don't recognize them. And
I think it's just ticket. What do you think? Why do you think that is, Bob? Because I think this has serious consequences for all of us, and not just from a financial end. I mean, I am of the belief, for better or worse, Broadway was, quote unquote, the flagship of the American theater, for better or worse. Mm-hmm. And I do think eliminating that flagship, particularly as a potential source of money for the artists, perhaps more than anything else, is not going to benefit it's not going to benefit anyone, because we're not replacing it with anything.
It's a disaster.
And we're not replacing it in the audience, and when I say the audience, not just the New York audience, the national audience. We're not replacing it with anything. It isn't like that Broadway's dead and now the national audience is all of a sudden aware of the Guthrie. I mean, it just doesn't seem to be working that way.
Well, you can't all go to the Guthrie if you want to see a play. You
right.
can't go to Cambridge. We can't go to Cambridge if you want to see a play. We have a special weekend thing.
And he has brochures. He has brochures with him.
But, you've got to have your own theater. And the fact is, the one time I recognize, when I go to the New York Public Theater, I recognize an audience. It looks like the old Broadway audience going down there. I recognize them. At Neil Simon's last Biloxi Blues, I recognize the audience. I saw, this is the New York audience. It's come back to life. Here it is. But the other shows, I don't see them. Even Iceman Cometh, I didn't see the New York audience anymore, and I wonder where they've all gone. And I think that audience is simply not going to pay those outrageous prices to go to the theater. It's an outrage to have to pay that much money to go to the theater. No one's dealing with this problem. It's a problem that's endemic. It's been going on for at least 15, 20 years as the unions have, done their negotiations and their transactions, and the feather bedding has grown and grown and grown, and the producers have given away this in order so they can get this, and big hunks of profit are going to a great variety of people, and the audience is the one that's left out. And as a result, the audience has said no. They've simply said, we're not going to go. And that's created the coma.
And do you not feel that there is a trickle-down effect in terms of, again, my ongoing concern is keeping artists in the field, which I think is our biggest challenge.
Well,
I think that
right.
the problem the theater has more than, and there may be dancers or people in the audience who disagree with this, but I think that the biggest problem that the theater faces more than any other art form is retaining its artists in the field, because they are so easily, and in many instances appropriately, lured away by television. And,
sure.
And the only card we had was the ultimate Broadway hit that would make you a decent living.
Well, the American actor still nurses a nostalgia for the stage, and can't speak for all of them, but I know a lot of them do. Not for nonprofit theaters. I mean, they're not going that far. They began there and they enjoyed their time, but once they've gone to Broadway and gotten, say, $1,200 a week as compared to the $350 or $450 a week they make, they're not going to go back to the nonprofit theater except for one show, as a kind of nostalgia trip. But let's talk about the commercial theater. I think they do nurse, many of them do nurse, a genuine affection for the theater and love it. And would love to be able to afford it. Would love to have some security in it, but they are being scared away from it. The more they appear, in one show and only play for 2 weeks when they've given up that television or they've given up that movie in order to do it, the more they think they're a bunch of dodos. They shouldn't do it. And we're losing very, very fine theater artists. Playwrights we're not losing. I mean, David Mamet can write films, but boy, he's a playwright. He's going to stick to the stage. Designers we won't lose, because designers in many ways are the genuine artists of our stage. They are becoming more and more the real committed artists and the sacrificing artists of our stage. If the actors were like the designers, we'd have a terrific theater, because they give a lot up, those designers, in order to work imaginatively on the stage. Directors, you can always get a director to do a play. It's actors. Actors are very hard to get and very hard to keep. We think we've discovered something, and it's touring. Touring keeps actors. First of all, if you go to Europe, go to Venice, if you go to Avignon, if you go to Edinburgh, actors love to travel. And
unlike the rest of us, of course, who don't want to go to Edinburgh or Avignon or Venice.
And actors also love to have response from audiences other than their normal audiences, which almost compensates for the kind of applause and response they get on Broadway and the kind of special features they'll get in the New York Times. We've been able to keep actors with that. We've had a good record from that point of view. We don't lose many actors, but they also get great satisfaction in the work they're doing, and the audiences adore them. We have full houses, so that also is happy for the actor. They hate to play to half houses. So speaking personally, we've been able to hold them, but I know that actors are hard to hold.
Okay, guys, here we go. Into questions here. Okay. Bob, this is to you. It's not to me, surprise, surprise. If you are only published once every 3 weeks, how do you choose which play to write about? Or is the choice yours, or is it an editor, or do you select the play, or does someone else select the play?
It's completely my own. I have had the great good luck to have total freedom as to what I write about. Used to be how often I wrote, not anymore, and how long I wrote, how long the piece was. And that freedom I still enjoy. I have to play by the seat of my pants, by what I think I'm going to enjoy. I go to as much as I can. I obviously can't see everything because I'm traveling down from Cambridge, and I'm putting in a full day, 6 days a week, 7 days a week up in Cambridge. So I have to sneak in on Saturdays and Sundays, see 2 matinees on each day, and I get as much in as I can on that occasion. But I simply choose what I think is going to be most interesting. And since I don't feel a compulsion to be, to be comprehensive, that my readers are waiting on my every word as to what play they should see, because I'm not doing that kind of guide. I'm writing an essay on this play and its significance, let's say, in the American theater or in this particular time of our lives.
This next question, I think, was you answered to a certain extent, but you might want to repeat some of your points, was do you think that critics support the creativity of resident theater any more than they do commercial theater? It seems to me, the person who's asking the question, that regional and New York City critics also review not-for-profit resident companies on a show-by-show basis, rather than to evaluate the company's artistic body of work as a whole, as in the European theater. I think
you're absolutely right. But let me make 2 points.
Okay.
One is that in those cities where there have been resident theaters over a long period of time, I think particularly of Washington, has an excellent critic for the Washington Post, who does treat an institution as an institution, recognizes the relationship between the plays. The same thing is true of the Guthrie, Minneapolis Tribune, Mike Steele. Same thing is true, I think, more and more of Los Angeles. It is not true of New York because there is no permanent theater here. Can you imagine it? New York City, one of the greatest, largest cities in the world, does not have a nonprofit resident classical theater. Doesn't have it. I know that the Roundabout does plays sometimes, but doesn't do it with a permanent company. Circle in the Square does classical plays, I know, but not, jobs in people, stars. There's no resident theater in this city. Think about that. That's a very significant omission. Lots of attempts, always at Lincoln Center, and they always flop. Because New York, you don't grow fruit, you sell it. And a resident theater has to be grown. It takes a long time. It takes a lot of patience. Can't be instantaneous, instant culture.
What role, if any, does criticism play in theater training? Actually,
doubtful that it plays any role at all. I don't think critics recognize the importance of theater training. It's only recently that even funding groups have recognized the importance of theater training, because there, of course, is the seed that grows into the flower, that grows into the bouquet that is sold in the window. the seed, the seeding and the nurturing and the nourishing, if I can use that garden metaphor, is not something that pays immediate dividends. You see it over years. I mean, I can't go to a play anymore without finding one of my old students in it, or designing it, or directing it, or having written it, or producing it. And that's a terrific experience personally, but also what it says is these are all the people that once were students. Why don't they recognize the need to nurture them and to appreciate them and to fund them when they're students, not just when they become successes and get their...
Now, when you were at Yale, Bob, you did incorporate a theater criticism program, correct? I mean, for the
Yes.
training of theater critics. I mean,
Right.
as part of a dramatic criticism program.
Right. Most unpopular program in the school. These students were terribly isolated from the rest of the practicing students. Michael Feingold was one of the earliest of those students, by the way, and we'll never forget something later became known as the bloodbath, when we would have the criticism students practice by getting up before the school and giving their opinions, as it were, of some repertory theater production that had taken place, with the actors and the directors there. And there was Michael kind of twisting his buttons as he does when he talks, and touching things, and giving one of the most outrageously volatile and aggressive attacks on this particular Three Sisters that anybody did, and no one would talk to him for months. And we recognized that this is not the right way to integrate a criticism program into the school. So what we did was to put the critics to work as dramaturgs. We invented the dramaturgs program, and we invented a Master of Fine Arts in Dramaturgy, in which the critics actually worked with the director and with the actors, providing background material, research, in-house criticism rather than exterior criticism. And then when they got their MFA, then they could go on for another year or two and get a doctorate in criticism. By that time, they knew how the theater worked, and they weren't just sitting on the sidelines throwing brickbats. And that worked.
Here's someone who disagrees with you about a particular production. Sunday in the Park was an innovative piece with extraordinary music. Why did you respond less than enthusiastically? Isn't Sondheim the best the American musical theater has produced to date?
To date?
Yes, according to this person.
I would say he's the best working today, alas. I'm not a Sondheim enthusiast. I find his lyrics very witty. I find him to be a highly sophisticated and highly intelligent worker in the theater, and I'm glad we have him. But I think we're victims of hype if we think he's a great artist and a great innovator in musical theater. I've been sitting and listening to Sunday in the Park with George, having seen it twice. I've been listening to the record and listening to the record and listening to the record, thinking, ready to admit that I'm wrong about this music, but it's not music. It simply is not. It's some sort of repetitive hypnosis that passes for music. And I'm not a square about music. I was trained as a musician. He knows a great deal more about it than I do. I'm ready to recognize an innovator. I'm also ready to recognize something I told you to start with, that I'm all wet and my opinions don't count for anything. But I've been asked for my opinion, and I can tell you,
And you'll stick by it.
I'll stick by it for the moment until he comes across with something really exquisite will change my mind. Let me say, in anticipation of the fact that he will change my mind, the reason why I'm so uncertain about opinions, I went to see a movie with my wife and some friends, Young Frankenstein. And we all agreed this was a pretty childish, infantile attempt at humor. And we were very convinced about our opinions, and we went home and we talked about it and so forth. Then I went with my son, he was about 14 at the time, and we howled together. And I went to exactly the same movie within weeks and had diametrically opposite impressions of it. And I've learned since then to distrust my opinions implicitly. Don't count on me for a trustful opinion. I won't give it to you.
At what point, this actually is a very interesting question, Bob. At what point do you draw the line in theater when an artist might be tearing a play beyond recognition? I would assume this person is perhaps referring to an avant God director or something along those lines.
I think there's a confusion between kind of taking a knife to the Mona Lisa or to, the Botticelli's Venus or something like that. You can desecrate a permanent work of art. You can't desecrate a play. play continues to exist. It's there as a text. It'll always exist. And it seems to me that naturally we'll get angry if it's badly treated, but don't feel that it's been destroyed. It's going to pop right up again like all of those little pieces of the broomstick in the Disney version of The Sorcerer's Apprentice and start to dance again. It's alive. As long as it's a text, it's alive. So I happen to be a very permissive critic in regard to these various directorial assaults on plays. I can get just as angry as anyone else can when they fail, but I don't think that real desecration is being done.
What roles do you see for theater in society?
I see a very important role for theater in society. Sometimes I think theater is society. Sometimes I think theater is the greatest barometer we have of society.
Sometimes society is theater, too.
Pardon me? Society is theater, right. And of course, we've seen ever since the 60s how theater extends itself into everything we do. I mean, we have now, for the first time in history, we have an actor as president. No, he's not an actor. He's an announcer. We have an announcer as president. So that, it says something about the importance of theater in this country.
Some people feel, just to interject one of my questions here, some people do feel that the fact that American life, with the invasion of media into every possible private nook and cranny of American life, that somehow that has made life so theatrical that it sort of takes away from what the theater can do, because every day you read the newspaper, it's so theatrical. What could you possibly do on stage that could match it?
Life is pretty good. It's pretty good. I enjoy life, and I think it's
except for the final act.
It's
it has a terrible
too.
last act.
I think a great artist can give us an alternative to life that, if it's not equally good, is certainly enhances our experience of life. I don't think it replaces it. I'm pluralistic. I believe in many different kinds of expression. Let's have life. I don't want to do away with life. And let's have art. They're not the same. They're contiguous, but they're not the same.
Please specify and elaborate the marrying of current auteur, again, I think this would probably be director, current auteur, director, and classics.
Okay. It's going to be in funny places, but for example, Lee Brewer's Gospel at Colonus, if any of you saw that, which is a black gospel version of Oedipus at Colonus, is an interesting marriage of an avant God auteur director with classical text. Text is there, the myth is there, and yet it's been totally transformed according to our experience. In this case, it's mostly black experience, but it's an experience we all share. I just came back from Venice where I saw Suzuki's Clytemnestra. It's a reworking of the Oresteia, of the Sophocles Electra and the Euripides Electra by a great Japanese artist. It's his own, and yet it sends out these roots to history and tradition. Robert Wilson is going to make his first effort with a text with us in February. Robert Wilson has mostly worked with his own work or with Heine Müller, East German dramatist, who's almost a co-extension of him. And now he's going to do Euripides' Alcestis, and he's going to do a Kyogen play as the epilogue. That, I think, is another example. Andrei Serban, who I know can't get to first base in New York for some reason, is a very
they used to at La Mama. His work was very well received.
Very well received, but now they decided that he's not in. So, but we work with him
he's sold
as
out
often as we
Circle in the
can.
Square.
Yeah, I think he takes a very interesting approach to a number of classics. Chekhov, he's done all the Chekhov plays now, and I think in almost all cases he's done brilliantly with them. He did a Sganarelle for us and a Kingstag, a Gozzi Kingstag for us, which we're delighted with, and everyone else has been delighted with so far. I think he's a very important classical director, and he does not approach the classics in any way in a pious way, which I think is one of the reasons he's getting smacked around. Who else? Joanne Akalaitis, Mabu Mines, mostly working with her own work or collective work, has now turned to the classics. She did an Endgame for us last year and is going to do Jean Genet's The Balcony this year. More and more I find that these directors making peace with the tradition, as long as they can somehow express themselves through the tradition, and I think they're finding ways to do that.
And clearly you feel that that marriage also enhances the classic itself.
Oh, absolutely. You see, I've never, my fight with the 60s people was that they hated the text. They wanted to kill Ibsen, they wanted to kill Chekhov, and what have you. No, you mustn't do that. I said, what you can do is marry them. You can create a new child with them. But you can't, if killing them is not going to get any of you anywhere, and didn't. And I think when the counterculture made peace with the culture, by which I mean the tradition of art, and saw that it could express itself through the tradition, I think that formed the synthesis that I had always been dreaming about and hoping for, and that's why I say I have great hope now for the American theater.
Do you see any, do you have any fear of what is certainly remarked on, I think, just virtually everywhere, that the deterioration of language is going to in any way affect the theater? Or do you think that the current deterioration of language is affecting the theater? Do you think there is any sort of connection there?
Well,
in your hope, I mean, I am admiring of your hope for the future is what I'm trying to say.
I've always believed, in language. I use language as a critic. I try to use it when I speak. I don't think it's all that important in the theater. I don't think it's as important as a lot of critics have made it out to be. I mean, Aristotle didn't think it was that important either. He knew that a play, the important thing in a play was the action. That was first and foremost. The plot was the soul of the action, as he called it, was the soul of the theater. Next came ethos, or character. And after that came language. And
then there were problems with syntax right
and
after
syntax
that.
and what have you. But it's the English that put language first in the theater, which is why their theater bores me. It is not an imaginative theater, it's not a metaphorical theater, it's a theater of language, and generally of prose, it's not a poetry at all. And those critics who go to a Shakespeare production, and we've just seen this play transformed and delivered to us in an entirely new way, and say that the poetry was left out. I mean, I don't think they know what poetry is. Shakespeare knew that poetry on the stage was both of the stage and in the stage, that it was not just verbiage, which of course he did better than anyone, but it was the construction of action and character and the relationship between that and what was happening with the audience. So I'm not one that bemoans the deterioration of language. David Mamet, for example, if you read his plays, they look virtually inarticulate, and yet I would say they're among the most eloquent plays being written today. Glenn Ross is a highly eloquent play, and it's made up of monosyllables and obscenities. The English would not approve of that. Well, maybe they would, because it was done there very successfully. But it's not it's not a play of verbiage. It's a play in which the language becomes a medium rather than the thing itself.
I know no one who has said, quote, "When I grow up, I want to be a theater critic," unquote.
No one in their right mind.
How does one back into criticism as a livelihood?
One, you mean me? I can't speak for the others.
This is a very polite author of this card.
I don't know how you... I know people who are desperate to be theater critics now, and I think more and more people are writing to me and say, how can I be a theater critic? Who can I write for? Where can I submit this? So I think there is a growing interest in theater criticism. But you're right, people don't begin... Well, actually, one friend of my little boys began. He was 8 years old and he was writing theater criticism, Brian Drutman. And he's working in criticism now. I went into it because I was an actor, and my friend Elliot Silverstein, who was a director, later went to Hollywood and became a director, said, "You're a good writer. Why don't you write theater criticism? If you become famous, then they'll want you as an actor." That's the way I backed into it. I got too interested in the writing criticism, so I stopped acting for a while.
Here, this is from the profound, the prosaic here. I am going to Boston this coming weekend. Is there anything worth seeing? Do you want to give out a phone number? This is a very eclectic audience here at the 92nd Street Y.
Well, that's very sweet of you.
And they're very close to the Eastern Shuttle, obviously.
San Francisco Mime Troupe was up there this weekend. The Huntington Theater is opening its production of, I think, As You Like It. We Are Dark. We just come back from a tour. We start rehearsals for our new season Tuesday. You could come to rehearsals, but they're closed until the final week, then you can come to rehearsals. There's something called Greater Tuna, which I think you saw here, and it's open there. Not much interesting things at the moment, but it'll get pretty hot soon.
What is the best play you ever saw, and why do you feel it is the best?
Oh, that's a tough one. Best play I ever saw.
How about best play and best production, if those are two separate experiences?
Best play and best production. That's hard. I've seen wonderful things.
That's not answering the question, Bob.
What do you do about, Cantor's theater, Viepoli, or Dead Class, or those aren't great plays, but they're some of the most haunting things one will ever see in the theater.
And his company is playing at La Mama now,
Right
as
now.
we speak, as a matter of fact. So I would echo Bob's endorsement.
Einstein on the Beach is one of the great theater experiences of my life. I think it's not a great play, but it was a great theater experience. I think the Long Day's Journey into Night that I saw with Frederick March, in spite of the fact that Florence Elder's a little weak in that, I thought that was one of the great productions I'd ever seen. It was Quintero, and a great play.
Was it seeing a play as a child that got you into the theater, Bob? I mean, what got you into the theater? I mean, was it a particular production?
I remember the first play I ever saw was something called Swinging the Dream. This is interesting now that you think of it, because it was a reworking of Shakespeare. It was a reworking of Midsummer Night's Dream. 1938, I must have been about, what was I? No, earlier than that, 36. I was about 9. And it had Louis Armstrong in it playing Bottom, and it had Bojangles Robinson playing Theseus and Oberon. Had Maxine Sullivan playing Titania. And there were two bands in the boxes that played during intermissions. One was Benny Goodman's quartet, and the other was Bud Hawkins. I think it was a tenor sax player. I saw it opening night. It closed the second night. The critics killed it. I thought it was the most stunning thing I had ever seen, and I think you would have too. It was simply lovely and very innovative when you think about it. It was a black Midsummer Night's Dream, and it was beautiful, musically beautiful, and it was acted with these great musicians and performers. And they killed it. So.
Please comment on what influence you think the Chicago theater is having on the rest of the theatrical scene.
Interesting. Chicago theater has been a very healthy development. It is essentially a grungy, David Mamet is a perfect representative of it. It's grungy, it's obscene, it's realistic, essentially. It picks up the life of that city in all its desperate criminality and beautiful architectural exaltation and what have you, all those funny combinations of things. And it's produced a couple of 2 or 3 very good theater groups, Wisdom Bridge, Steppenwolf, and the Goodman Theater, at least, and you can name others. Essentially, it's a realistic development. So it fits right into too well into our mainstream commercial theater and next movies. Steppenwolf has really carried actor studio realism, naturalism a little step further. It's a little more energetic. It's got more febrile rhythms in it. And I fear for that organization, as I've said in print, because I fear too many of its members have now been lifted away from Chicago to come to New York to be feted and exalted and written about in the newspapers and then sent out to the movies and the series. And they do come back, they collect for this show or that show, and they even have reunions in Chicago, but that's the way resident theaters get destroyed. It's a perfect example of it, while stars get made. And that's what's happening, it seems to me, this continual fragmentation of things that have to be a social unit, an ensemble. Our world is essentially individualistic, opportunistic, and involved with the self. And that goes against theater. That's why we in theater are struggling so hard to make it happen. It's also why it is a gallant struggle, and why it's so connected as, we were talking about the relationship with society. If we can make it happen in the theater, we can make it happen in society. We can have a society that works, which we help each other, work for each other, as well as for ourselves. and not simply for our own careers and our own opportunities.
And this whole threat to the theater of careerism and star-making and celebrity is a uniquely American phenomenon. I mean, this is not a problem that the British actor faces, for example, where...
Until he comes here.
Pardon me? Until he comes here. But is it not true in England, for example, that he or she is as respected for working for the stage as they are working for the movies? I mean, apart from the fact that it's in the same city and it's logistically easier.
More respected working for the stage.
And that's unheard of in this country.
Someone like Olivier does movies, as he says. He does it because he has a lot of families to support. But his love is the stage. And he'll do commercials as well on television, but he will not allow those to be seen in Britain, only in the United States. Whereas, you're right, our actors do not find, many of them, most of them, some of them do, but most of them do not find their identity on the stage. They find it in the movies, and then they come back to the stage.
Because this is what the American society recognizes, that if you are in the movies, you are valid in a way that you are not by working on the stage.
That's correct.
Sort of depressing. Is Robert Wilson for the theater of the second half of this century what Brecht was for the first half? Great question.
It's an interesting question. I don't know if he's quite that seminal and imitable. I think he's specially himself. I think there will be imitations of Wilson, but Wilson is peculiarly himself, and I don't think he's capable of being imitated. Whereas Brecht was able to, create a whole aesthetic that he would not only practice but write about. And he did have an influence and an effect on writers and directors, particularly directors who came after him. So I don't think it'll be quite as seminal.
If commercial theater is dead or dying in New York, how will the ensemble theater, as in a resident company, you talk about be financed? Yeah.
What's the question?
How will the ensemble theater that you talk about be financed with the absence of commercial theater?
Well, it was financed very well without commercial theater up until the time commercial theater began to co-opt it. It was financed through a combination of box office, very important, about 50 or 60% of its support. Private foundations were very important in the early days and no longer are very important. Public foundations like the state, which is getting more and more important. This state is very good on that subject, very good in its contributions to the arts. And the government, the federal government, which has not been moving very quickly, but for a while looked like a real answer to the prayers of fund-hungry theaters. And individual and corporate support, which is growing. Corporate support is the big surprise. It really is growing. And through that combination, the theater can survive and even prosper. But I think it has to prove that it is interested in its own community and not simply in using that community as a stepping stone to some other glory or glamour.
What do you feel are the reasons for the decline in good original theater productions? Is it the product of this decade's poor economics, and will it change again when our economy does?
I think we have good plays being written, as good as ever, and good productions. I just don't think that the machinery of the commercial theater can encourage those, support them, or produce them. I think they're going other places. People will not take big bankrolling chances on a new Shepard play. Shepard's never done a play on Broadway, and yet he's our, if not our leading, he's certainly one of our leading dramatists. 20 years ago, he would have been Tennessee Williams or Arthur Miller. He would have been having a play a year on Broadway. Now he does it off-Broadway in resident theaters, and he becomes a movie star.
Or he marries one. If the audience is another actor, could we consider a review that addresses the interaction of the actors and the audience by having a post-performance discussion?
Sure. That's what we're doing now in a way, but it's not really the kind of way I like it. I like more of a contact than through the... But you're right, yes, those post-performance
I don't know if it means a post-performance discussion that somehow has impact on the final review. I think that.
No, I think that's what Edwin Drood did, didn't it? Edwin Drood took a vote on how the play should end. It was making theater by democratic fiat. And as usual, I voted for the wrong candidate. I voted for Mondale again. but you vote for the actor who you think killed Edwin Drood, you see, and then they are ready to enact the play that way. But I don't think that's the way you make works of dramatic art or even dramatic entertainment.
Who do you think are the promising playwrights, directors, actors?
Playwrights: David Mamet, Sam Shepard, William Hauptmann, author of Big River, but he's author of better plays than that, plays of his own. Christopher Durang, wonderful, ferocious satirist. Marcia Norman, Night Mother, particularly. Jules Feiffer has written some good plays. Lanford Wilson's written plays, not particularly of my liking, but he's written some very solidly crafted plays. I'm sure I've left out a lot of people. Directors, we've named most of them. I happen to like the more adventurous directors. There are two kinds of directors. There's the kind of Stanislavski director and there's the Meyerhold director. The Stanislavski director is there to service the playwright and to give the playwright the best possible expression of his or her play available through molding of the actors to conform to the playwright's vision. And in that theater, the playwright is predominant. And that kind of director in the past was Elia Kazan, it was Arthur Penn, it was, directors from the Actors Studio. And there's still a lot of good ones around. Then there's the Meyerhold director, who is more of an auteur, in which he is able to manipulate not just the language of the occasion, which is the play, and of course the action, but also the scenic devices, the visuals, the lighting, a new form of acting, in order to break through to something fresh in what you're seeing and hearing. Normally with a play you've already seen, a play that's familiar to you, that you have to see again with fresh eyes. Now that kind of, those two kinds of directors are do not fight each other. They're two very important strains in the theater, and both should be encouraged and should exist. I happen to enjoy, if I have a good play, I want a Stanislavski director. If I have a classic, I want a Meyerholdian director. It works that way.
In the New Republic, you refer to Joe Egg as, quote, a play you're not allowed to hate, unquote. How does one explain to an audience member who is sucked into the sentiment that such a play is not a truly valuable work of drama, but a sappy melodrama?
I don't know, except I'd
like to
elaborate on that phrase I used, because I think there is a real genre of plays out there, especially on Broadway, which you're seeing more and more of, which I've called plays you're not allowed to hate. Because if you hate them, if there might be plays about AIDS, might be plays about homosexuals, might be plays about blacks, plays about the handicapped, and so forth. If you go away hating them, and if a critic you don't praise it, you may be accused of being opposed to the issue itself, which is not at all true. You just may be opposed to the way it's been developed on the stage. And keeping that distinction, that kind of sociological distinction from the aesthetic one, is very difficult for critics, especially of major newspapers. Because you can imagine, the letters column, if you say that this particular play that is involved with a single issue group, like women, is no good.
Hey, wait a minute. Watch it.
Or men, or any single issue. So I think that's a dangerous development for our theater. I also think it's a very sentimental development. I think it's a pretty opportunistic one, too, because the people writing these shows, I'm not talking about their motives, but at some point they must recognize that they are co-opting their audience into liking something that they may not like at all.
Aren't there certain standards for evaluating the merit of a play? And if so, if there are such standards, why is there so much disagreement among critics?
There are no standards. We make up the standards. We begin with a seat of our pants, and then we find justifications for our opinions. I know I'm having a great experience at a play when a little tingle goes goes absolutely up my spine, and then it gets between my shoulder blades. It's a purely physical function that I'm experiencing. And I know something's happening then. And I can feel that tingle once, say, at one of our own performances, and not feel it anymore for the rest of the run, but I felt it that one night. Or, you know, that's why it's so unjust to go to a play and see one performance and make your judgment on the basis of that. Because the performance does change, and next night you might get that tingle. And what you're writing about is that tingle, even though you think you're writing very objectively and detachedly and, you know, with the weight of scholarship and years and the heritage and tradition on your shoulders, you're writing about that tingle. And that tingle is a very subjective, physical thing. So, no, there are no standards. We pretend there are, but there aren't.
I think it's good to know when there are no standards. As an aspiring critic, I am an admirer of the writings of Tynan, Peter Brook et al., and I would like to know what you feel is the most important preparation for a drama critic. Is participation in the theater essential?
No, it's not essential, but it's desirable. I think the more you know about the theater, the better the critic you're going to be. You don't have to be a good actor, and you don't have to be a good director or a playwright, whatever you do in the theater. In fact, just hang around a little, see how the work is made. And I think also, if you see how much passion and feeling and suffering, really, goes into the making of these works, I think you'll find yourself much less flip about dismissing them. You may not like them, but you won't be quite as flippant in the way you get rid of 4.5 months' worth of work and sweat with one flick of your pen.
Could you elaborate on how they could have, to use your phrase earlier, updated Iceman?
Well, first of all, they did a little. I think the lighting, Tom Skelton's lighting, was very advanced, but the production did not follow along. There is an opening scene in which, if you've seen the production, in which everyone is just dead out in various degrees of drunkenness, sleep, death. And it was very promising, because I thought maybe we were going to get this kind of stylized work. And the light was very gray, and I thought the whole thing was going to be underwater. These were going to be fish underwater, as O'Neill actually describes them in his stage direction. But then they woke up and they went into a realistic panorama. And I just felt there was I don't know what it would be. If I directed it, you know, I'd have to think about it. But I knew that it would be something that surprised me more than that production surprised. I was not surprised. And that, too, is something we look for as critics and as audience members. You know, the old Diaghilev thing, étonnez-moi, astonish me, do something surprising. If you don't surprise me on the stage, if I'm coming to see something totally expected, then I'm really involved with the conventional. I'm not involved with what the theater's about, which is the unconventional and the unexpected.
How would you define the differences between the British critics and the American critic? What do you think we can learn from each other?
Have more newspapers. That's the difference.
No, it's a serious difference.
And, you know, the same things happen to newspapers as happen to the theater. The ravenous, competitive, commodity culture has pushed everything aside but that one survivor, which is, you know, the Times, or the Post, or the News to a lesser extent.
But it's really the Times.
The Times has survived, and I'm sure it's happy it survived, and may even profess itself to be happy that it survived virtually as the only newspaper, but I think it's hurting the paper seriously to have survived as the only newspaper. And I'm certain that Frank Rich does not bear easily the burden of being the only critic in New York.
He will be here to tell you this later.
I know it's true that he doesn't. It must give him many sleepless nights. To his great honor, it has not made him fudge in any way. It's made other critics fudge, which we will not name at the moment, for the Times. But it did not make Mr. Rich fudge. He really, you know, he may be wrong, but he's not fudging his opinions.
But Bob, is it also not the case, or rather it is the case, in London in particular, that the critics do not have that much effect on whether the British public goes to the theater or not? Because
there are more newspapers. When you have, you know, 14, 18, 20 newspapers, you may read one newspaper, but you're not really going to determine your theater-going habits by what he said, because you may read in the ad that 25 other critics may have liked it. Or someone else may tell you that the critics liked it. Anyway, the critics do not have that impact on the West End, even the commercial theater. And I think it's largely because there are all these newspapers. Whereas if there's only one critic and one newspaper, it does have an effect. Not universal effect, isn't always going to close a show or make a show a hit, but pretty often it does.
Where can the playwrights of tomorrow learn their craft? Not how to write TV sitcoms or movies, but plays for theater as it will be tomorrow, or as it will exist tomorrow.
Well, Shelley said, look into your heart and write. I don't know how much learning there is. We taught playwriting at Yale, but I don't know if people actually learned how to write plays at Yale. The great advantage we gave the playwright at Yale was the capacity to work with actors and a director. That's where you learn. You can learn something about structure, you can learn something about taste, something about language, that's useful. But the practice of playwriting, alas, not many young playwrights can practice it. But if the playwright can associate through a grant or something with a working theater, or a group that he or she may develop together, just to see how it works on a stage, that's the best training there is.
What is the relationship between ART at Harvard and the Loeb Drama Center, and what is the function of each?
Harvard takes a benevolent and indifferent attitude towards the American Repertory Theater, which is our salvation. We are a department of Harvard, but an entirely autonomous one in the sense that we have to provide all our own support, financially and otherwise. In return for certain teaching services, and we teach 11 courses to Harvard undergraduates through our company, we receive a stipend to the Loeb Drama Center, which goes partially to put on student plays and partially to supervise those student plays. Now, the advantage is that, if you have our designer, say, or our technical director, who's working for us as a technical director, is also supervising the technical direction of the students' works, we can kind of split that salary and get some of the Harvard money for him. So that is an advantage. We get a stipend there. We get the free use of the Loeb Drama Center, all except 12 weeks of the year when the students have it. And that's a beautiful theater. It may be one of the most versatile and beautiful theaters that I've ever worked in. And the beauty of it is, by the way, that it is a stage the size, with the versatility of the very best theaters in this country, even the Met. I think it's almost the stage opening of the Met, and an audience of 556. So great artists can work there and get all their equipment and all their effects and what have you, and they will have the intimacy of an off-Broadway house. So that's a very unusual combination. That's our relationship. We teach courses to Harvard. We run the Loeb and supervise extracurricular theatrical activities with Harvard undergraduates, and we do our own shows, our own series there, and we have to get off the stage 12 weeks a year. We are also trying very hard to start an institute where we can start training young people for the theater, do that nurturing that we were able to do at Yale in those years. And if I can get that, then I will, 20 years later, be back where I was in 1966.
It's the way it goes. I have one final question, and then I think we will wrap this up and all go swimming at the 92nd Street Y. Which is, since you do function as a producer as well as a critic, do you ever feel a conflict of interest when you are reviewing artists' work that you also produce? And how do you compensate for that?
I'm continually confronted with a problem, particularly since the ones that I've trained or worked with are the ones that are the most difficult. I declare, generally in the article, my personal involvement with the person I'm talking about, and say the hell with it, I still think he's good, or lousy, as the case may be. But it's hard. And I've had to find different critical strategies. I don't use the conventional critical strategies anymore as a result. It's very rare when I just go after a production or a play. I'm really trying to find a context for that reason so that I can get off the personalities involved without, I want to appreciate them, I want them to be acknowledged, but I want to get off the personalities and into the significance of the event.
I want to thank you all for coming tonight, particularly. Thank you. particularly in this heat. And I guess I will be seeing you in 2 weeks, 3 weeks? 2 weeks, 3 weeks. Soon. I will be seeing you again soon. Hopefully it will be cooler.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.